8-year-old Tommy Parker pressed his back against the cold metal wall of the cargo bay, trying to make himself as small as possible. The darkness around him felt alive, pressing in from all sides. Every breath he took sounded too loud in the silence. His heart hammered so hard he thought it might burst right out of his chest. The crash had happened 3 hours ago, maybe 4. Tommy had lost track of time. One moment, the ship was humming along normally through space, and the next, red lights were flashing everywhere and sirens were screaming so loud his ears hurt. His mom had been in the cockpit with Captain Williams when it happened. Tommy had been in the tiny bathroom at the back of the living quarters, reading one of his books like he always did when he got nervous about the long space journey. By the time he realized what was happening, the evacuation was already underway. He'd run through the corridors, his small legs pumping as fast as they could go, calling out for his mom. But the smoke from the damaged engine made everything foggy and confusing. He'd taken a wrong turn somewhere and ended up in the cargo bay instead of the main evacuation point. When he finally found his way back, everyone was gone. The ship was empty except for the groaning of twisted metal and the hiss of leaking air from somewhere deep in the walls. Tommy had waited by the airlock for what felt like forever, hoping someone would come back for him. But nobody came. His mom was out there somewhere, he knew that much. Before communications went completely dead, he'd heard Captain Williams ordering everyone to head north toward the emergency beacon. 15 miles through alien wilderness. They probably thought he was with the group already. They probably didn't even know he was missing yet. Tommy reached into his blue backpack and felt around inside, counting his supplies again even though he'd already done it twice. 3 protein bars that tasted like cardboard. 1 water bottle almost full. And the 5 storybooks his grandma Betty had stuffed into his bag the morning they left Earth. "You're going to be gone for 6 whole months, sweetie," she'd said, her wrinkled hands smoothing down his hair. "When you get homesick up there in space, you just read one of these stories and remember that home is always waiting for you." Tommy wished his grandma was here right now. She always knew what to do when he was scared. She'd make him hot chocolate and tell him stories about when she was young, and somehow everything would feel better. A scraping sound from outside the cargo bay made Tommy's whole body go rigid. His breath caught in his throat. Through a crack in the damaged hull, maybe 3 feet long and half a foot wide, he could see movement. Something big. Something moving in the purple twilight of this alien planet. Then he saw them clearly. 3 creatures, each one enormous, stalking around the crashed ship like wolves circling wounded prey. They stood at least 12 feet tall, their bodies covered in scales so black they seemed to swallow the dim light. But the scales weren't just black. They glowed. Patterns of light rippled across their bodies in waves of deep red and angry orange, pulsing like a heartbeat. Tommy's hands started shaking so badly he almost dropped his backpack. These had to be the Drakkar. He'd been only half listening during the mission briefing 2 weeks ago, more interested in his comic book than the boring adult talk. But he remembered the captain's serious voice when she talked about this planet's apex predators. "If we encounter Drakkar, we evacuate immediately. No exceptions. No heroics. These creatures are responsible for the loss of 3 previous exploration teams. They hunt in packs, they're highly territorial, and they've never let anyone escape alive." The scraping sound grew louder. Closer. Tommy watched through the crack as one of the creatures dragged its claws along the ship's outer hull. Where the claws touched metal, sparks flew. The metal itself began to glow red-hot, melting under the heat. These things had claws that could generate their own plasma heat. They were cutting through the ship like it was butter. Tommy scrambled backward, his sneakers squeaking against the floor. His mind raced. There was nowhere to hide in the cargo bay. Just a few supply crates and empty containers. The main door was sealed shut from the crash damage. The only way out was through that crack in the hull, and that's exactly where the monsters were. The largest of the 3 Drakkar suddenly stopped moving. Its head turned toward the crack, toward the cargo bay, toward Tommy. Even from 15 feet away, Tommy could see its eyes. They glowed like hot coals, burning amber in the darkness. Intelligent eyes. Predator eyes. Eyes that had found their prey. The creature let out a sound, something between a hiss and a rumble that Tommy felt in his bones. The other 2 Drakkar immediately stopped what they were doing and turned their attention to the same spot. All 3 of them now focused on the cargo bay. On Tommy. The boy's mouth went dry. His grandmother's words echoed in his head, "Home is always waiting for you." But suddenly he wasn't so sure he'd ever see home again. The metal door exploded inward with a screech that made Tommy's ears ring. Chunks of twisted steel scattered across the floor like toys. The largest Drakkar pushed its massive head through the opening, its body too big to fit all at once. It had to tear away more of the door frame, the metal screaming in protest, before it could squeeze its shoulders through. Tommy was frozen. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even blink. His brain was screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't work. He just sat there against the wall, watching this nightmare unfold in front of him. The creature's head was the size of a refrigerator, covered in those black scales that pulsed with angry red light. Its snout was long and filled with teeth that looked like they were made of glass or crystal, each one catching the light and reflecting it back in sharp points. Drool dripped from its jaws, sizzling when it hit the floor. The stuff was acidic or burning hot, Tommy couldn't tell which. Hot breath washed over him, smelling like sulfur and burnt metal. The Drakkar's amber eyes locked onto Tommy with an intensity that made him feel like an insect under a magnifying glass. Those eyes saw everything. They saw a small, helpless creature. Easy prey. The massive head lowered, coming closer. The jaws opened wider, and Tommy could see all the way down its throat, glowing faintly with internal heat. This was it. This was how he was going to die. Alone, on some alien planet, eaten by a monster, and his mom would never even know what happened to him. His hands moved on their own, desperate and shaking, fumbling with the zipper of his blue backpack. He didn't even know what he was looking for. A weapon. There was nothing in there that could hurt this thing. A shield? His protein bars weren't going to protect him. But his hands kept moving anyway, digging through the contents until his fingers closed around something familiar. A book. One of Grandma Betty's books. Tommy pulled it out, and for a split second he almost laughed at how stupid it was. Here he was, about to be eaten alive, and he was holding a children's storybook. But then something in his brain clicked. If he was going to die, he didn't want to die screaming. He didn't want his last moments to be full of terror and pain. He wanted to remember home. Where the wild things are, Tommy said out loud, his voice barely a whisper. His throat was so tight he could hardly get the words out. He opened the book with trembling hands, the pages crackling because they were old and had been read 100 times before. By Maurice Sendak. The Drakkar's head stopped moving. Just stopped, frozen in place about 3 feet from Tommy's face. The boy could feel the heat radiating from its scales, could see his reflection in those burning amber eyes. But something changed. The creature's head tilted to one side, just slightly, like a dog hearing a strange sound for the first time. Tommy's voice cracked as he started reading the story. Tears were already streaming down his face, blurring the words on the page, but he knew this book by heart anyway. His grandma had read it to him when he was little, and then he'd read it himself dozens of times over the years. It was a story about a boy named Max who went on an adventure to where monsters lived, and Tommy had always loved it because Max wasn't afraid. Max tamed the monsters. The words tumbled out, shaky and broken, punctuated by little gasps and sobs. Tommy kept waiting for the pain, for those crystal teeth to close around him, but it didn't happen. Instead, something impossible occurred. The Drakkar's jaw slowly closed. The glow in its eyes shifted from angry amber to something softer, more orange-yellow. Its massive body settled down onto the cargo bay floor with a heavy thud that shook dust from the ceiling. The creature was sitting. Actually sitting down. Like it was getting comfortable. Tommy's voice got a tiny bit stronger. He turned the page, his small fingers leaving sweaty prints on the paper. Behind the lead Drakkar, the other 2 creatures had stopped their destruction of the ship. They weren't tearing at the walls anymore. They weren't hunting. They were pushing through the enlarged doorway, squeezing their huge bodies into the cargo bay, moving closer to Tommy. But they weren't moving like predators anymore. They were moving carefully, almost gently, like they didn't want to scare him. Like they wanted to hear better. The second Drakkar, slightly smaller than the first, settled down on Tommy's left side. The third one, the smallest of the group, laid down on his right. Their glowing patterns had changed from aggressive reds to calmer blues and purples. The pulsing rhythm slowed down, becoming almost hypnotic. Tommy kept reading, his voice growing steadier with each sentence. He described the pictures in the book, the way Max sailed away in his private boat, the way the wild things gnashed their terrible teeth and rolled their terrible eyes. And with every word, every page turn, the Drakkar stayed perfectly still. They were listening. These massive, deadly predators, these creatures that had killed every human who'd ever encountered them, were sitting quietly in a circle around an 8-year-old boy, listening to him read a bedtime story. Tommy didn't understand it. It didn't make any sense. But he wasn't about to stop reading. Not when it was the only thing keeping him alive. Tommy's throat felt like sandpaper after the first hour. Each word scraped coming out, rough and painful. He'd already finished Where the Wild Things Are, twice because the Drakkar seemed confused when he closed the book, like they were waiting for more. So he just started over from the beginning and they settled down again, content. His voice was getting hoarse, but he didn't dare stop. What if stopping broke whatever spell this was? What if the moment he went quiet, they remembered they were predators and he was prey? He reached into his backpack and pulled out the second book. The Gruffalo by Julia Donaldson. His grandma had loved this one because it was about a clever mouse who invented an imaginary monster to scare away predators. The irony wasn't lost on Tommy as he sat surrounded by real monsters. As he read about the mouse walking through the deep dark wood, something strange happened. The Dracker's scales began to flicker in time with his words. When he described the fox with his terrible teeth, the largest Dracker's scales flashed bright red for just a second. When the mouse talked about the Gruffalo's purple prickles, ripples of purple light danced across all three creatures. Tommy paused, his finger on the page. Were they responding to the story? He kept reading, watching them more carefully now. When the mouse outsmarted the fox, the smallest Dracker's scales brightened, almost like it was pleased. When danger approached in the story, all three creatures' lights would dim and pulse faster, like they were worried. They weren't just listening. They were understanding. Somehow, these alien creatures were following the story, feeling what the characters felt. Tommy's fear started to fade, replaced by something he never expected. Wonder. Pure, simple wonder. He was sharing stories with aliens. Real aliens. And they cared about what happened to a made-up mouse in a made-up forest. He finished The Gruffalo, and immediately grabbed the next book, not wanting to lose their attention. Charlotte's Web was thicker, longer, and his grandma had warned him it was sad. You'll probably cry, honey, she'd said. But that's okay. Good stories make us feel things. Tommy started reading about Wilbur the pig and his friendship with Charlotte the spider. His voice was barely a whisper now, cracking every few sentences. He took small sips from his water bottle between chapters, trying to make it last. The smallest Dracker, the one that was only about 10 feet tall instead of 12, shifted its position. It slowly, carefully, lowered its massive head until it was resting on the floor just 3 feet from Tommy's legs. The boy's heart skipped a beat, but the creature didn't attack. It just settled there, its eyes half closed, watching him read. The scales on this one were changing colors more than the others. When Tommy read about Wilbur being lonely, deep blue waves washed across the Dracker's body. When Fern came to visit the pig, the blue shifted to lighter shades, almost turquoise. It was like watching emotions painted in light. Hours crawled by. Tommy had no idea what time it was anymore. His phone had died in the crash, and there were no windows in this part of the cargo bay except for the damaged hull that showed only darkness outside. His stomach growled. He was hungry, but he was afraid to stop reading long enough to eat. When he reached the part where Charlotte died, something incredible happened. Tommy's voice broke and tears started falling again, but this time not from fear. The story was just so sad. Charlotte had saved Wilbur's life, and now she was gone, and Tommy couldn't help crying. The Dracker's lights all dimmed at once, fading to dark blues and purples. The smallest one made a sound, low and soft, almost like a whimper. Were they sad too? Could they understand death? Loss? Sacrifice? Tommy wiped his eyes and kept reading through his tears, his voice thick with emotion. When he got to the part about Charlotte's babies, about new life and new hope, the lights slowly brightened again. Warm oranges and gentle yellows spread across their scales like sunrise. He pulled out The Velveteen Rabbit next, even though his throat was screaming for rest. This was another sad one about a toy rabbit who wanted to become real. As Tommy read about the rabbit's love for the boy and how love could make you real even if it hurt, all three Dracker moved closer. They formed a tighter circle around him now, their massive bodies creating walls on all sides. But it didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like protection. Like they were guarding him instead of trapping him. Tommy noticed their breathing had synchronized with his reading rhythm. When he spoke, they seemed to breathe slower. When he paused, they waited patiently, their scales pulsing in a gentle, steady beat. The night stretched on forever. Tommy read his last book, Where the Wild Things Are, again for the third time. His voice was barely a croak now, but he pushed through. The Dracker didn't seem to mind that they'd heard this one before. They responded to it just like the first time, their scales dancing with the adventure. Finally, as Tommy was wondering if he could even speak anymore, the first rays of dawn light filtered through the crack in the hull. Purple alien sunlight stretched across the cargo bay floor, touching the edge of the smallest Dracker's tail. Tommy closed the last book and looked around at the three creatures surrounding him. They hadn't moved in hours except to breathe. Their scales were glowing soft blues and gentle greens now, peaceful colors. The largest one had its eyes fully closed, still sitting upright but clearly resting. He'd survived the night. An 8-year-old boy had survived a night surrounded by the galaxy's deadliest predators, armed with nothing but children's storybooks. And somehow, impossibly, they weren't enemies anymore. The sound of voices outside the cargo bay made Tommy's head snap up. He'd been drifting in and out of sleep, exhausted from reading all night. At first he thought he was dreaming. But then he heard it again, clearer this time. "Tommy?" It was his mom's voice, sharp with panic and fear. "Tommy? Where are you?" Relief flooded through Tommy's chest so powerfully he almost started crying again. She'd come back for him. She'd found him. He tried to yell back, but his throat was so raw that only a painful croak came out. Then he heard the sound of boots on metal, multiple people running. The rescue team. They were coming. Tommy's relief instantly turned to ice-cold terror. The weapons. They'd have weapons. And the moment they saw the Drakkar, they'd start shooting. "Wait." Tommy tried to shout, but his voice was gone. It came out as barely a whisper. "No, wait, don't." The cargo bay entrance suddenly filled with people. 6 adults in orange rescue suits, all carrying pulse rifles that hummed with charged energy. Tommy's mom was in front, her brown hair wild and her face streaked with dirt. Captain Williams was right behind her, a tall woman with gray hair and eyes that had seen too many bad situations. Tommy's mom took one look at the scene and her face went white. Her son, her baby boy, was sitting in the middle of 3 massive Drakkar, the creatures that had killed dozens of explorers. The creatures that were supposed to be unstoppable killing machines. "Get away from my son," his mom screamed, raising her rifle. The other team members fanned out, all of them aiming at the Drakkar. Red targeting dots danced across the creature's scales. "No." Tommy finally found his voice, rough and broken as it was. He threw his arms out wide, putting himself between the rifles and the Drakkar. "Don't shoot. Please don't shoot them." "Tommy, move," his mom yelled, her hands shaking on the weapon. "Move now. Those things are going to kill you." "They're not." Tommy's throat felt like it was tearing with every word. "They won't hurt me. I promise, Mom, just don't shoot." The largest Drakkar had been resting with its eyes closed, but now its head lifted at the commotion. It turned toward the humans at the entrance, and Tommy heard several rifles click as safeties were released. This was it. If the Drakkar made one wrong move, one aggressive gesture, everyone would start firing. But the creature didn't attack. It didn't roar or bare its teeth or charge forward. Instead, something happened that made everyone in that cargo bay freeze in confusion. The Drakkar's scales began to change colors and patterns. Not random flickering but organized sequences. Waves of blue flowed from its head down to its tail, then back again. Pulses of soft yellow followed, creating rhythms. The pattern repeated 3 times, exactly the same each time. Then the other 2 Drakkar joined in. Their scales lit up in perfect synchronization with the first one, all 3 of them creating the same pattern simultaneously. Blue waves, yellow pulses, then a ripple of purple that sparkled across all their bodies at once. It was beautiful. And it was clearly intentional. "Hold fire," Captain Williams said quietly, her eyes wide. "Everyone hold fire." Dr. David Hayes, the team's xenobiologist, slowly lowered his rifle. He was a thin man with glasses that were always sliding down his nose, and right now his mouth was hanging open in shock. "This isn't possible," he whispered. "This can't be possible." "What?" Tommy's mom demanded, still keeping her weapon trained on the largest Drakkar. "What are they doing?" "They're communicating," Dr. Hayes said, his voice full of awe. He took a step forward, still staring at the light patterns. "That's not random bioluminescence. That's structured. Sequential. It's language." The Drakkar repeated their pattern again, but this time they added something new. After the purple ripple, spots of orange appeared on their scales, moving from one creature to the next in a wave. It looked like they were passing something between them, sharing it. Tommy's throat hurt too much to explain properly, but he tried anyway. "They like the stories," he croaked. "I read them stories all night and they listened. They understood, Mom. They understood the stories." "Stories?" His mom looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "What are you talking about?" Tommy held up one of his books, the cover worn and bent from being read so many times. His mom recognized it immediately, one of the books her mother had packed for him. Dr. Hayes moved closer, ignoring Captain Williams's hissed warning. His eyes were darting between Tommy and the Drakkar, his brain clearly working overtime. "You read to them?" And they responded. Tommy nodded. They changed colors based on the stories. When things were exciting, they'd flicker fast. When things were sad, they got darker. They felt what was happening in the books. The scientist ran a hand through his thinning hair, making it stick up in all directions. "My God," he said again. "We've been classifying them as non-sentient predators for 20 years. But if they can understand narrative structure, if they can follow emotional arcs in stories, that's not just intelligence. That's abstract thinking. That's empathy." The largest Drakkar did something then that made everyone gasp. It turned its massive head toward Tommy, moving so slowly and carefully that it was clear the creature was trying not to frighten anyone. Its scales shifted to soft blues and greens, the same peaceful colors they'd been showing all night. Then it made a sound. Not a roar or a hiss, but something almost musical. A series of low notes that resonated in Tommy's chest. The other two Drakkar echoed the sound, creating a harmony. "I think," Tommy said softly, smiling despite his exhaustion and fear, "I think they're trying to tell you their own story now. They're trying to show you they're not monsters." His mom finally lowered her rifle, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Tommy," she breathed. "What did you do?" Tommy looked at the three Drakkar, these incredible creatures that could have killed him in seconds but instead had chosen to sit and listen to a scared little boy read bedtime stories. "I just shared something from home," he said. "That's all. Just stories from home." 3 months had passed since that night in the cargo bay, and Tommy still couldn't quite believe where he was standing. The Galactic Council chamber was enormous, with a ceiling so high it disappeared into shadows. Representatives from 47 different species sat in curved rows of seats that rose up like a stadium. Some of them looked almost human. Others were so strange that Tommy had to remind himself not to stare. His mom stood next to him, her hand resting on his shoulder. She'd barely let him out of her sight since the rescue. On his other side was Ambassador Patricia Chin, a short woman with kind eyes who'd been assigned to handle the Drakkar situation after everything that happened. Behind them, massive holographic screens floated in the air, showing video footage from Drakkar Prime. Tommy watched himself on the screen, looking tiny and scared in that cargo bay, surrounded by creatures that could have ended his life in seconds. It felt like watching a movie about someone else, not something that had actually happened to him. Ambassador Chin stepped up to the speaking platform, her voice amplified so everyone in the chamber could hear. "Honored members of the council," she began, "for the past 200 years humanity has classified the Drakkar as Category 5 threats. Mindless predators. Kill on sight protocol. We lost 3 entire research teams to them, 72 lives total. We believed we understood what they were." She paused, letting that sink in. "We were completely wrong." The holographic display changed, now showing recent footage from the planet. Drakkar were sitting in groups with human researchers, their scales creating elaborate light patterns while the humans typed frantically on tablets, trying to decode the meanings. One Drakkar was moving its head slowly back and forth while a scientist held up different colored cards, the creature's scales matching each color perfectly. "Their communication system is so fundamentally different from ours that we mistook it for simple threat displays," Ambassador Chin continued. "They don't use sound as their primary language. They use light, color, pattern, and rhythm. Every scale on their body is part of their vocabulary. When we saw their scales flashing red, we thought it meant aggression. We never considered it might mean curiosity or excitement or even joy." Tommy's throat tightened as he watched the screens. He remembered those first terrifying moments when the Drakkar broke into the cargo bay. He'd been so sure he was going to die. "But one human child," Ambassador Chin said, gesturing to Tommy, "discovered something we missed. He discovered that the Drakkar have never encountered narrative storytelling before. Their light language is immediate, present tense. They can communicate complex ideas about what's happening right now, but they'd never experienced stories about things that didn't actually happen. Fiction was completely alien to them." The display changed again. Now it showed Drakkar younglings, smaller versions only about 6 feet tall, sitting in a semicircle around a human teacher. The teacher was reading from a tablet while the young Drakkar's scales rippled with constantly changing colors. They looked mesmerized. When Tommy read to them, the ambassador explained, it opened something in their minds they'd never accessed before. Abstract thinking. The ability to imagine scenarios that don't exist. To feel emotions for characters who aren't real. To learn lessons from situations they've never experienced. An older council member, a being that looked like a walking tree with blue bark, raised one branch-like arm. "How does this change our threat assessment?" it asked in a voice like wind through leaves. Ambassador Chin smiled. "The Drakkar aren't predators in the way we thought. Yes, they're powerful and dangerous when threatened. But they're also highly intelligent, deeply emotional, and capable of forming complex social bonds. They attacked our previous teams because we came in with weapons and defensive postures. We treated them like monsters, so they responded like we expected them to. Tommy's mom squeezed his shoulder gently. He knew this part was coming. Ambassador Chin had prepared him for it. Tommy, the ambassador said, looking at him warmly, would you like to tell the council what you've learned? Tommy's heart hammered as he stepped forward. Public speaking terrified him way more than the Drakkar had. But he'd practiced this with his mom and Grandma Betty, who'd come all the way from Earth to see him. The Drakkar had never heard stories before, Tommy said, his voice small in the huge chamber but amplified by the sound system. Stories about things that didn't happen, about people who don't exist. When I read to them, they were confused at first. But then they started to understand. They felt what the characters felt. They learned from what the characters did. He took a breath, remembering what Ambassador Chin had told him to say. They wanted to learn more. After that first night, they kept coming back. Not to hurt anyone, but to hear more stories. And then they started trying to tell us their own stories using their lights. They wanted to share back. The holographic display now showed something beautiful. Drakkar and humans together in a large room, the aliens creating elaborate light shows on their scales while humans watched and recorded. Then the humans would read stories, and the Drakkar would respond with their own light language interpretations. The recommendation before this council, Ambassador Chin said firmly, is to establish First Contact Protocol Revision 7. From now on, before we send in military assessments, before we start trade negotiations, before we make any judgments about a species, we share stories. We share who we are through narrative. We give them a chance to share their stories with us. The vote was called. Tommy watched as representatives pressed buttons on their consoles. The results appeared on a massive display, unanimous approval. Every single species voted yes. After the session ended, Fleet Admiral Richard Banks approached them. He was a big man with gray hair and a chest full of medals. Tommy recognized him from the news. He'd been the one who originally declared Drakkar Prime off-limits to humans. Son, the Admiral said, kneeling down so he was eye level with Tommy, I spent 30 years in the military. Trained with the best weapons, the best tactics, the best strategies. And you did something with a children's book that all my firepower never could have done. You showed them we're not just another species fighting for territory. You showed them we're storytellers. Tommy felt his face get hot. I was just scared, he admitted. I didn't know what else to do. That's what makes it brave, the Admiral said, standing up. Doing the right thing when you're terrified. Now, 3 months after that terrifying night, the human settlement on Drakkar Prime was thriving. It was the first joint colony in galactic history, with humans and Drakkar living side by side. Every evening, as the purple sun set, groups would gather in the common areas. Humans would read stories while Drakkar listened, their scales painting pictures in light. Then the Drakkar would share their own histories, their legends, their dreams, all translated through the light language that humans were slowly learning to read. Tommy's grandma had been right all along. Stories could take you anywhere. They'd taken him from terror to friendship, from certain death to making history. They'd taken him home. And they'd taught the whole galaxy that sometimes the bravest weapon wasn't a gun or a bomb. Sometimes it was just a book and the willingness to share what's inside it.